The pump rebuild kit will solve any problems you might be having with your air compressor concerning pressure building, such as a compressor that builds pressure very slowly. Or maybe it builds to a certain point, but then stalls and just continues to run without building any more pressure. Most of these problems are caused by a worn-out cylinder or piston assembly. They can also be caused by worn valves on the valve plate, or sometimes the valve will actually break right off. The kit also includes all the gaskets you need to rebuild the pump. This is an easy repair to do, and all of the parts we use in this video and many more are available on our website at eReplacementParts.com. Let's get started. The OF 5015 OTS air compressor is a modular design, where the pump assembly can be removed from the tank assembly. It'll be easier to work on if I go ahead and do that. So I'll disconnect the air hose, unlock the pump from the tank, and then I can just lift the pump away from the tanks. Now I'll remove this plastic end cover from the pump assembly. Next, I'll remove the cooling fan. You'll notice that there's a couple of mounting locations on the fan. They use this for different air compressors. I'm just going to mark the location that we're using so I remember which hole to use when we put it back together. I'll put a screwdriver through the other mounting hole and rotate the fan around until it binds up on the connecting rod. Then I can go ahead and remove the screw that holds the fan in place. Now we'll go ahead and remove the tube that connects the pump to the tank. Now we'll begin disassembling the pump. It's held together with 4 bolts. I'll go ahead and remove those. Now we can go ahead and disassemble the various components of the pump. It's a good idea to make note or even take a picture as you do this, so you'll know how everything lines up when you go to put it back together. Now we'll remove the piston from the motor. The connecting rod is clamped around a bearing on the motor shaft. To remove it, I just loosen the screw at the bottom of the connecting rod, and then as I pull on the connecting rod, I'll strike the end of the motor shaft with a mallet until it comes free. Sometimes the connecting rod can be a little stubborn, in which case you can insert a screwdriver into the slit at the base of the connecting rod, twisting the 2 halves of the connecting rod apart, and again strike the motor shaft with a mallet. Now we'll take a second and look at the components of our pump and figure out why our compressor wouldn't build pressure. First, I have the valve plate. You'll notice that the valves are intact, and I don't see any wear on the valves themselves that would indicate that the valve was leaking. These all look good, so I don't think this was the problem. If we look at our piston cylinder, the first thing I notice is the cylinder has lots of grooves on it. And if I rub a fingernail, I can actually catch the fingernail on those grooves. So I would suspect this was our problem. Simply the sill between the piston ring and the cylinder has worn out. You also see a lot of material that's been ground away. So I'm sure this is why our compressor wasn't building pressure anymore. Now we can begin installing our pump rebuild kit. First I'll insert the connecting rod through the cylinder, and then I'll pull the piston into the cylinder. Now install the 3 cylinder O-rings over the cylinder and up onto the flange, and then I can place this entire assembly into the compressor. Now I'll reinstall the connecting rod onto the bearing on the motor shaft. You'll notice there's a counterweight. I'm going to set that counterweight about 90 degrees to the connecting rod with the little screw up. Once that's aligned, I'll just tap the connecting rod back onto the bearing with my rubber mallet. And then I'll snug that screw at the base of the connecting rod back up to the bearing. Now I'll reinstall the valve plate, referring to the photographs that I took earlier to make sure that I get everything oriented correctly. First the lower gasket, then the valve plate, the head gasket, and the head. Now reinstall the head bolts, and we'll tighten them down. Unfortunately, Rigid doesn't provide a torque spec for these bolts, so we'll go until they're just snug, but I will work in a crossing pattern so I tighten everything evenly. First I'll bring all the bolts to finger tight, and now work around with the wrench and tighten them up the rest of the way. Now I'll reconnect the tube between the pump and the tank. Now I'll reinstall the cooling fan. I want to make sure that the long side of the offset is towards the counterbalance. And now I'll reinstall the pump cover and secure it with the screws. And we'll finish up by reinstalling the pump assembly back onto the tanks.